I also wanted to note that while I was working on this, there was a faculty study group on my bondage and my freedom, and I learned a great deal from my colleagues, and I'm very grateful for everything that I learned from them in the conversations, and I just wanted to note my thanks. So. For 3 years after his escape from the slave state of Maryland, Frederick Douglass worked as a laborer in New Bedford, Massachusetts, living with his wife and children, when, at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, he was unexpectedly called from the audience to speak about his prior life as a slave. His impromptu speech caused a sensation, and he was soon recruited to give speeches at abolitionist events throughout New England and New York. He records that, quote, "My speeches were almost exclusively made up of narrations of my own personal experiences as a slave." After several years of giving speeches, Douglass tells us, members of his audience began to doubt that he had ever been a slave. He gave few particulars about his life, such as the names of his owners, and he appeared too educated. His manner of speech contradicted, he says, all the facts concerning the ignorance of slaves. Thus, approximately 4 years into his career as a public speaker, Douglass wrote the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, giving the names of persons, places, and dates, so readers could affirm the truth of his story. He answered his critics as to the factual nature of his public narrative. But what of the other criticism, his apparent education? Douglass's friends, the abolitionists with whom he traveled and who enabled him to trade a life of unskilled labor for one of social action, gave him rather startling advice. Quote, "Give us the facts," said Collins. "We'll take care of the philosophy. Be yourself and tell your story. Better to have a little the plantation manner of speech than not. 'Tis best that you not seem too learned." The outrageous condescension surprised and stung Douglass, for it came precisely from those excellent friends who were exerting all their powers to abolish slavery. He was quick, however, to forgive them on account of their good intentions. Still, Douglass could not follow their advice. Quote, "It was impossible for me to repeat the same old story month after month and to keep up my interest in it. To go through it night after night was a task altogether too mechanical for my nature. I could not always obey, for I was now reading and thinking. New views of the subject were presented to my mind. It did not entirely satisfy me to narrate wrongs. I felt like denouncing them. I was growing and needed room." I'm quoting these reflections from Douglass's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, written 10 years after the narrative. Douglass appears to move from simple narration to reflection to philosophizing and moral exhortation. Yet it's also clear that Douglass, long before he told his story, indeed in the story itself, was already thinking, reading, growing, as often and as much as the highly constrained circumstances of his youth allowed. I have entitled this lecture, Moments in the Liberal Education of Frederick Douglass, drawing an analogy between his education and the one that we undertake jointly. But is the phrase liberal education in the two instances used only equivocally? Each is an education towards freedom in some sense, yet the situations are starkly different. Douglass, of course, was enslaved, with no genuine leisure, no access to formal schooling, no consistent companions in learning, no open access to books, including even the Bible. Our conditions are the opposite in every respect. We're free in the political sense. We're fortunate to have the leisure to read and converse at length, with more wonderful books at hand than we have time to take up. At the time Douglass obtains his freedom, he's still a young man, the age of a sophomore. His education has only just begun. It may seem that the freedom sought in the two educations are fundamentally different. Douglass, striving to learn, sought freedom in the most concrete, literal sense. We seek freedom from unexamined opinions, and perhaps an intellectual freedom that enables us to be responsible citizens in a democratic republic. Yet I will describe Douglass's education in freedom as closely as I can through several revolutions of his soul, in order to see how his heroic example might in some way illuminate our own education, although I admit the work of comparison I will leave us to do collectively in the question period or in private reflection. The description comes in 3 parts: the mysteries of his earliest childhood, his discovery of reading, and his fight with the overseer, Edward Covey. As a child, specifically in his first 8 years, Douglass lived a life of poverty and comparative freedom. Quote, freed from all restraint, the slave boy can be, in his life and conduct, a genuine boy, doing whatever his boyish nature suggests, enacting by turns all the strange antics and freaks of horses, dogs, pigs, and barn door fowls, without in any manner incurring reproach of any sort. He literally runs wild. He has no pretty little verses to learn in the nursery, no little speeches to make. Douglass tells us that he had no knowledge he was a slave. The only shadow to pass over these free moments were occasional references to a mysterious personage, the old master. The fact of being a slave was incomprehensible to him. How could he be dependent, entirely dependent, on the will of somebody he had never seen? His childhood experience of freedom arises, in part, from the simplicity and seeming self-sufficiency of this way of life. Quote, if the boy feels uncomfortable from mud or from dust, the coast is clear. He can plunge into the river or the pond without the ceremony of undressing, for his little tow linen shirt is easily dried. He eats no candies, gets no lumps of loaf sugar. He always relishes his food. Children in their state of seeming freedom cannot conceive of slavery, and when they're told about it, whether they're black or white, enslaved or free, they admit it is wrong. Outside the interference of adults, they can see no grounds for the difference between free and unfree. The two are the same at play. To play with others freely is to tacitly acknowledge their equality and to share in their nascent intelligence. This is not to say that the state of the roaming, playing child is the truth of freedom. The child inexorably becomes an adult. Play is replaced by work, and work in itself is not bad. The reciprocal compensation of children at play is replaced by the independence of the free laborer who can negotiate his compensation with an employer, save a portion of his earnings, and gradually establish himself. The child's experience of freedom appears to be the first grounds of Douglass's conviction in the naturalness of freedom. The first steps in the education of young Frederick are provoked by mysteries. One mystery. Who is this mysterious personage, the old master, that adults speak of ominously? A second mystery. Who is his father? In his earliest years, Douglass lives with his grandmother and rarely sees his mother. The adult Douglass says of his father, quote, this is shrouded in a mystery I've never been able to penetrate. There's something uncanny about his early free existence. His origins are undeclared. Those whom he should depend on, his parents, are largely unknown to him. Instead, he depends on an unseen, incomprehensible power, the old master. The third mystery appears when Douglass, perhaps 8 years old, is moved from his grandmother's cabin to the great house. Here he witnesses the horrific flogging of his Aunt Esther by the mysterious old master. For the reader, the context of the flogging begins to resolve some mysteries, such as why families are hardly permitted to exist among the enslaved. But it's not clear how much the boy, quote, hushed, terrified, and stunned, comprehends at that moment. No one witnesses such intense suffering without asking why. So I'm going to read a long quote here. The heartrending incidents led me thus early to inquire into the nature and history of slavery. Why am I a slave? Why are some people slaves and others masters? Was there ever a time when this was not so? These were the perplexing questions which began now to claim my thoughts and to exercise the weak powers of my mind, for I was still but a child. By some means, I learned from these inquiries that God, up in the sky, made everybody, and that he made white people to be masters and mistresses, and black people to be slaves, and that he made white people to be masters. This did not satisfy me, nor lessen my interest in the subject. I was told, too, that God was good, and that he knew what was best for me, and best for everybody. This was less satisfactory than the first statement, because it came point blank against all my notions of goodness. Besides, how did people know that God made black people to be slaves? Did they go up into the sky and learn it? Or did he come down and tell them so? All was dark here. It was some relief to my hard notions of the goodness of God that, although he made white men to be slaveholders, he did not make them to be bad slaveholders, and that in due time he would punish the bad slaveholders, that he would, when they died, send them to the bad place where they would be burnt up. So that's the end of the quote. Douglass had been touched by overshadowing mysteries, the absence of his father, the lurking semi-presence of the old master. But the horror before him prompts deeper and more far-ranging questions. He begins with the immediate circumstances. Why are there masters and slaves? When or how did this begin? The answers to these questions lead him further afield. God made masters and slaves, and the masters who are bad here are punished elsewhere. But these far-off answers only prompt still more difficult questions. Is God good? How can one know what he intends? It's all framed naively. His conceptions of the divine are naturally childish. The more he asks and the more he hears, the less content he is. His searching mind, seared by grief, is not easily sated. It's revealing that the first barrage of questions is spurred by extreme suffering. The initial focal point of his questioning is himself. Why am I a slave? Outraged and angered by what he's observed, he fears a similar fate for himself. The child's illusion of freedom is shattered. Felt pain seeks a why, a cause, an underlying condition that might be changed. The reason-seeking inquiry starts from direct personal experience and branches out to history, society, and divinity. This line of questioning eventually leads him back to Earth. He learns that enslaved adults were taken by force from Africa. In other words, slavery is a crime committed by men. God is liberated from any connection to this crime. He still might be good. The multiple mysteries are all quickly resolved, he says. Quote, the appalling darkness faded away, and I was master of the subject. And later, quote, there are thoughtful days in the lives of children when they grapple with all the great primary subjects of knowledge and reach in a moment conclusions which no subsequent experience can shake. I was just as well aware of the unjust, unnatural, and murderous character of slavery when 9 years old as I am now, without any appeal to books, to laws, or to authorities of any kind. It was enough to accept God as a father, to regard slavery as a crime. This one fact about slavery's history, that it was man-made, is almost the only thing he knows about it. But it sweeps aside all of the questions raised about God, prophecy, and providence. Witnessing the violence and knowing it's a crime filled him with suffering and a burning hatred. His desire to understand and his desire to be free are both animated by the same anger. Yet the fact that slavery is man-made also gives him a little hope. He becomes, quote, most strongly impressed with the idea of being a free man someday. This cheering assurance was an inborn dream of my human nature. It's a dream because he has no notion of how it is possible. He has no knowledge of the free states, none. He doesn't know that they exist. It's an inborn dream because lying behind the shock of witnessing violence is his recollection of his free-roaming early childhood. The violence makes clear that the original freedom of necessity can never be recovered. But the evident naturalness of that childhood freedom prior to all criminal violence allows him to project that freedom as a dream into an indefinite future. Part 2, the mystery of reading and the roaming mind. The next mystery Douglass encounters is the mystery of reading. Although this may be the most famous episode in Douglass's autobiographies, permit me first to relate the high points. Young Frederick is relocated to Baltimore, where the mistress of the house is the tender-hearted Sophia Auld. Sophia tacitly acknowledges Frederick's humanity. Quote, "I was more than chattel, and she felt me to be more than that. I could talk and sing, I could laugh and weep, I could reason and remember, I could love and hate. I was human, and she, dear lady, knew and felt me to be so." End quote. The young Frederick, observing Miss Auld reading the Bible, asks her to teach him, and she freely gives him the rudiments of reading. Her husband, discovering this fact, strictly prohibits the lessons on the grounds that they will ruin Douglass as a slave. Desperate to advance his reading by whatever means he can devise, Douglass cunningly enlists his white playmates in the neighborhood to extend his knowledge. After a few years of this, Douglass discovers and is transfixed by a book, The Columbian Orator, an anthology of speeches and short essays on freedom and human rights. If you remember learning to read as an occasionally frustrating and laborious, or if you have experienced the intermittent tedium of trying to teach someone else to read, one naturally finds Douglass's narrative a gripping account of the thrill of learning. At first, it seems Douglass is determined to read precisely because it is forbidden. According to Mr. Auld, a slave must be kept ignorant. Learning renders him unfit for his assigned duties. And, quote, "It would do him no good, but probably a great deal of harm, making him disconsolate and unhappy." The vehemence of Auld's prohibition convinces the young Douglass that he has inadvertently been let in on a great secret, the true philosophy of slavery. By his own account, Douglass's need to learn this skill arises most of all from his suspicion of Auld and his hatred of slavery. Yet one sees other sentiments at work too, his affection for and emulation of Sophia Auld, his genuine curiosity at the mysteries of the skill itself, and the playful, competitive encounters with his friends on the street. Thus, although the boy knows very little of his letters, has no notion of what he would read if he could, and although he's guided largely by the negative recommendation of Mr. Auld, he nevertheless immediately sees reading as the true pathway from slavery to freedom. Does it prove to be so? First, one has to recall the narrowness of Douglass's world. Quote, "The plantation is a little nation of its own, having its own language, its own rules, regulations, and customs. The politician keeps away because the people have no votes, and the preacher keeps away because the people have no money." End quote. It's a feudal fiefdom cut off from contemporary civilization. The civil power of the state has no standing here, especially as regards any relation between the free and the enslaved. Its religion is also unconventional, as we've seen. Too often are the enslaved deluded by religious teachings that enjoin them to submit to their masters. Slavery can be sustained, Douglass observes, only in its own congenial midnight darkness, where it can be indecent without shame, and murderous without apprehension or fear of exposure. For wider public opinion is an unfailing restraint upon cruelty and barbarity of slaveholders. The outside public must not see what happens within, and those within must not know what happens without. And thus, for example, living on the plantation, as I mentioned before, Douglass has no cognizance of the existence of free states. To some degree, for Douglass merely to move from the eastern shore to Baltimore widened his horizons, freed him from the claustrophobic fiefdom. Yet it's also clear that reading rapidly accelerated this progress. Quote, "The reading of those speeches in the Columbian Orator added much to my limited stock of language and enabled me to give tongue to many interesting thoughts that flashed through my soul and died away for want of utterance." Douglass laments the impoverished language of the plantation due to its isolation, the haphazard mixture of dialects, and gross vulgarity endemic to an environment of periodic brutal violence. He explicitly tells us of one word that was new to him, one that he could make no sense of: abolitionists. What was it that the abolitionists wanted to get rid of? To finally grasp the word meant to realize that there were many other human beings, otherwise entirely unknown, who understood the cruelty and brutality of slavery, and who were fierce enough to be feared and despised by slave-holding society. To read meant to discover, and gradually to enter, an extended active community of people grappling with the same momentous questions. This was the earliest step towards his stance as an author, in which he conceives of his opposition to slavery as universal, as a struggle by the whole human family for the sake of the same. Douglass does not say more precisely how his stock of language increased. He does note his excitement at reading the Columbian Orator. It's not hard to see how it helped him to give voice to the questions that had perplexed him. He notes reading the short dialogue between a master and a slave. The dialogue briefly touches on fundamental questions. Can power or violence confer a right? If the Bible says that it's the order of providence that one man should become subservient to another, is every successful exercise of power in accord with providence and sanctioned by God? Is theft? Is the escape of a slave? Is there any way a master can conduct himself with sufficient goodwill to render his ownership of a person legitimate? In meeting every argument of the master, the fictional slave exhibits a mental dexterity that persuades the still more fictional master to free him. Upon reading the book, Douglass says he feels able to respond effectively to the slaveholder's theology. The successful use of force in crime does not confer a right and does not signal God's approbation. The effect of his reading is seen in an episode occurring a little later, back on the eastern shore. Douglass's owner, Thomas Auld, gives him and other slaves so little to eat that they're desperate to find adequate sustenance, and Douglass is reduced to furtive theft. What is remarkable are the revolutions of thought he goes through to account for this. Upright in character, he hates stealing. He knows it's contrary to the law and to the gospel. Nevertheless, he deduces a right to steal from Auld on the hypothesis that he is Auld's property. Whatever is stolen from Auld is used to nourish Auld's property in himself, so that he may in turn serve Auld well. Therefore, nothing is actually taken from Auld. More remarkable still, Douglass says that the argument can be extended to apply to stealing from any free person participating in a slave society. Since no master could hold a slave without the cooperation and the connivance of other members of society, they are in effect co-owners of each slave, and so each slave is permitted to steal from any of them. The arguments are implicitly extended still further and seem to entail a right of revolution. One sees the effects of reading in the exactitude and dexterity of his reasoning on social and political questions. On the barest education, is he not philosophizing even then? I'm tempted to draw an analogy between the expansive free play of a child, spirited, joyous, uproarious, he calls it, and the broadening of Douglass's world through reading. He experiences some kind of liberation through reading and subsequent reflections. He can articulate, at least hypothetically, the grounds of his emancipation. He can refute the nonsense theology that sometimes persuades the enslaved to remain subservient. His mind dwells upon the principles of liberty and eternal justice. Liberty is not merely the subject of learning, it characterizes his experience of it. His reading and reasoning reach far beyond his cruel worldly experience. The inborn dream of freedom has taken a new shape. As the chapter title calls it, a change came over the spirit of my dream. If Douglass finds a new freedom in thought, it does not satisfy him. When Hugh Auld argues that Douglass must not learn to read, he says prophetically, learning would do him a great deal of harm, making him disconsolate and unhappy. And so it is. As the increase in knowledge does nothing to illuminate how Douglass might escape his servitude, it makes enduring this servitude more painful. Quote, knowledge had come, light had penetrated the moral dungeon where I dwelt. I was too thoughtful to be happy. It was this everlasting thinking which distressed and tormented me. Once awakened by the silver trump of knowledge, my spirit was roused to eternal wakefulness. Liberty was heard in every sound and beheld in every object. Similar to how the freedom of the roaming child awakens the inborn dream of freedom, but not the reality, one tastes but does not consummate freedom through everlasting thinking. Although from time to time Douglass writes like a Stoic philosopher, expostulating on the satisfactions of moderation and the torments of luxurious living, the interior life of the mind, however expansive, is not sufficient to enable him to endure his worldly, limited condition with equanimity. And though reading connects Douglass with a wider unseen community, locally, it isolates him. The facts of slavery already require the slave to conceal his thought. As Douglass notes, because ignorance is taken to be a virtue in the slave, the master, quote, the master studies to keep the slave ignorant, and the slave is cunning enough to make sure the master thinks he succeeds. They learn to say nothing rather than let slip a remark that could get them punished for impudence. A still tongue makes a wise head, is the maxim. As a result, the warmth of the relationship between Douglass and Sophia Auld is destroyed by his reading. He's determined to read against all obstacles, and she, persuaded by her husband, is zealous in trying to stop him. But it's not only the reading that severs their connection, but his unhappiness also alienates her, even though or because she doesn't understand it. Quote, she did not know my trouble, and I dared not tell her. She had changed, and I had changed too. Here too, quote, a change came over the spirit of his dream. That's a line from Byron. In quoting Byron, Douglass likens himself and Sophia to the two figures in the poem who were initially poised to be friends, but inevitably grow apart. For the sake of freedom, Douglass exchanges a friendship with a human being who is most touchingly acknowledged as humanity for a distant, discursive community. It is in the grief occasioned by the eruption of learning that Douglass's religious nature is awakened. It may make sense to step back and consider the trajectory of Douglass's faith so far. In his first exposure to religion as a small child, he's told that God made black slaves and white masters, that God was good, and that black slaveholders were punished in the next life. This is what he later calls the sham religion of the slaveholders. Even as a child, he was not satisfied with the notion that God decided who was a slave and who was a master, although he was contented to hear that there was some justice in the afterlife. When he reads the Columbian Orator, he becomes more confident in his doubts about the sham religion. He's certain that the fact of slavery does not confer a right and does not imply that it's willed by God. One also sees a slow, growing dissatisfaction with the expectation of justice in the life to come. In reference to his Aunt Esther, who was beaten so horribly, he says, quote, It's one of the damning characteristics of the slave system that it robs victims of every earthly incentive to a holy life. The fear of God and the hope of heaven are found sufficient to sustain many slave women. But this side of God and heaven, a slave woman is at the mercy of the power, caprice, and passion of her owner. He seems not content with any account of God's power that defers all satisfaction to the next life and confers no earthly incentive to good action. Let me pause to note that on the barest of resources, through persistent questioning, Douglass is freeing himself from the unexamined opinions of his community. At this moment, as his grief increases with his learning, he becomes increasingly skeptical of the sham religion that has nothing to take its place. And in the company of several men, black and white, he learns to pray, to have faith, and to cast his care upon God. One friend, Uncle Lawson, tells him, "The Lord has a great work for you to do." And Douglass feels this to be true without any sense of what that work might be. It's good for him that the future seems open. Douglass says later, quote, he longed to have a future, for to be shut up entirely in the past and present is to the soul what prison is to the body. And it belongs to slavery to take away one's future, as Thomas Auld tells him also later. Lay out no plans for the future. If you behave yourself properly, I will take care of you. Even good-intentioned mastery would, in the name of care, deny the future and keep the slave a child. If one trusts instead to a higher wisdom, closed to our sight, then Douglass depends on no man for his future. Having faith that the Lord has a great work for him, an earthly task, a future, he trusts he will not be a slave his entire life, and he finds he can bear with equanimity being slave for a while. Later as an author, he acknowledges that this belief, quote, that there was something more intelligent than chance operating in his life, this insertion of divine providence, might be regarded by some as irrational or superstitious. Yet this vague expectation that he will in some way be a useful man in the world sets his love of learning ablaze once again. Douglass finds relief from the despair of too much thinking by gaining faith in the open-ended future utility of his knowledge, a future overseen by higher wisdom and by no man but himself. Part 3, freedom in fact, if not in form. We have seen that Douglass's burst of intellectual discovery gave him a taste of freedom in the life of the mind, and that it sharpened his thinking about society and politics, but also left him still more discontent with his servile state. As the third stage in his education towards freedom, I'll look at the famous and decisive struggle with the slave breaker, Edward Covey. At the conclusion of this struggle, Douglass says, "I have reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. The Spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form." One wonders what role the struggle with Covey plays in Douglass's education toward freedom. For by Douglass's account, in this time, his intellectual life is suppressed, almost extinguished. His faith in a guiding higher wisdom is waning again, and his resurrection seems to rely simply on courage. Now 16 years old, and in the possession of Thomas Auld on the Eastern Shore, Douglass is hired out, rented to Covey, who has the reputation of breaking recalcitrant slaves to the yoke of bondage in the same way that men break horses. For the first time in his life, Douglass is compelled to do field work and is regularly beaten. Quote, "Frequent as the lash was used, Mr. Covey thought less of it as a means of breaking down my spirit than that of hard and long continued labor." What is surprising is that Covey succeeds. Quote, "A few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. Behold a man transformed into a brute." On one especially hot day of hard labor, Douglass collapses and cannot rise. At this point, it seems the brutification is complete. Douglass says, quote, "The man had obtained complete control over me. And if he had commanded any possible thing, I should have endeavored to comply." Covey, to get Douglass back to work, strikes him in the head with a hickory board, leaving a large bleeding gash. Douglass then rises and walks away 7 miles back to his owner, Auld. He intends to show Auld how his property, that is Douglass himself, is being damaged so that Auld will intervene and save him from Covey. Auld, of course, does not defend Douglass from Covey, but orders him back again. And upon his return, Douglass tells us, quote, "I brought my mind to a firm resolve to obey every order, however unreasonable, if it were possible. And if Mr. Covey should then undertake to beat me, to defend and protect myself to the best of my ability. My religious views on the subject of resisting my master had suffered a shock by the savage persecution to which I had been subjected." In the ensuing battle, Douglass parries every blow, but does not strike Covey, until after a 2-hour struggle, Covey relents and never again attempts violence against Douglass. By all appearances, Douglass attains freedom, in fact, if not in form, not through his nascent education and intellectual striving, but through courage, through a fighting madness, or an attitude of manly independence. Those are both phrases from the book, of course. The key, it seems, is not being afraid to die. It's fear of death that leads a human to submit to tyranny. The struggle itself appears to be a low affair with some odd comic moments. Douglass says it was undignified. But at the conclusion of the episode, he says, quote, "A man without force is without the essential dignity of humanity. Human nature is so constituted that it cannot honor a helpless man, although it can pity him." End quote. The final status of mutual recognition between them is, of necessity, tacit, never articulated or framed in terms of right. What Douglass learns of freedom is it requires force in combat, that dreams and deep thinking are not enough. I would like to refine this view somewhat by looking more closely at 3 moments or sub-episodes in his contest with Covey. Even prior to the critical confrontation, one sees that Douglass's faith had been weakening. As he first walked to Covey's farm, he told himself, "Like a fish in a net, allowed to play for a time, I was now drawn rapidly to the shore, secured at all points. I am, thought I, but the sport of a power which makes no account either of my welfare or my happiness." His faith in a higher wisdom learned from Uncle Lawson is in retreat. A little while later, as Douglass is gradually broken by hard labor, he says to himself, "Oh God, save me. Let me be free. Is there any God? Why am I a slave? I will run away. I will not stand it. I have only one life to lose. I had as well be killed running as die standing." These are the questions that he's asked from his earliest childhood. He wishes for salvation from God, but fears he'll have to obtain it for himself. This brings us to the first sub-episode. On the day that Covey strikes Douglass with the hickory board and Douglass flees, he retreats to the woods and, weary, falls to the ground. Still bleeding, the thought of dying in the woods comes to him, but he cannot tolerate it. He's not willing to die, at least not as the prey of buzzards. Then, quote, "After lying there about 3/4 of an hour, brooding over the singular and mournful lot to which I was doomed, my mind passing over the whole scale or circle of belief and unbelief, from faith in the overruling providence of God to the blackest atheism, I again took my journey toward St. Michael's, more weary and sad than in the morning." He ponders whether it is time to die, and then his mind turns again to the persistent questions. Is there a God? What he first conceives as a linear scale, faith on one side, atheism on the other, he now takes to be a circle. He's going around and around over this. With no sign that he's resolved it either way, and unwilling to disappear into nature, he rises, still bleeding, and walks to Ald's house in St. Michael's. For the second moment in the Covey episode, I consider Douglass's conversation with Thomas Auld. Douglass aims to persuade Auld that he should save Douglass from Covey in order to protect his own property. One is reminded of Douglass's favorite piece from the Columbian orator, the dialogue of the master and slave. When first reading it, Douglass had imagined that he too might be able to reason with his master in a way that would lead his master to free him. The capacity to reason with the master about the fate of his property is now put to the test. At first, Auld appears to be moved by Douglass's story, but Auld's humanity falls before the systematic tyranny of slavery, and Auld mechanically defends Covey's actions. Douglass is stunned into silence. Quote, "I had very little heart to reply. I must not affirm my innocence of the allegations, for that would be impudence and would probably call down fresh violence. Do you contradict me, you rascal?" is the final silencer of counterstatements. The fictional dialogue of the slave and the master, when put to the test, cannot be made factual, not because the slave may not outreason the master, Douglass has shown this to be possible, but because it's fundamentally contrary to the authority of the master to engage in a dialogue on equal terms. Contradiction is impudence. The conversation with Auld, wedged in the middle of the Covey episode, seems to point to the conclusion that reason must be set aside for the last spirited attempt at freedom. I now proceed to the third sub-episode, Douglass's conversation with another slave, Sandy. Before he returns to Covey's farm, Douglass again finds himself lying in the woods, just as he did when he left. Still too weak to struggle, he hides. Quote, "I'm in the woods, buried in its somber gloom, hid from all human eyes, shut in with nature and nature's God." Douglass tries to pray, but cannot. The sham religion of the slaveholders has left him with too many doubts. At this moment, Sandy discovers Douglass and aids him in several ways. One of these is to offer Douglass the root of an herb with magical powers of protection. Sandy tells him if Douglass wears the root on the right side, then Covey will not be able to strike him. In Douglass's mind, the talk of magical powers is absurd, ridiculous, and sinful. It's beneath his intelligence to countenance such things. Sandy responds that Douglass's book learning had not protected him from Covey so far. This Douglass could not deny, as it was proven by his recent conversation with Auld. And Sandy adds, even if the root does no good, it could also do no harm. It would cost nothing to try it. So Douglass takes the root. Quote, "Sandy had been to me the Good Samaritan, and had almost providentially found me and helped me when I could not help myself. How did I know but that the hand of the Lord was in it? I saw in Sandy too deep an insight into human nature, with all his superstition, not to have some respect for his advice, and perhaps, too, a slight gleam or shadow of his superstition had fallen upon me." To take the root may have been superstitious, but then perhaps Douglass's faith in the providence of higher wisdom was superstitious. He worries about that. Douglass returns to Covey's farm, and it being the Sabbath, he's received politely without punishment. On the next day, however, Covey tries to tie up Douglass in order to whip him, and the final struggle begins. So what do we make of these three sub-episodes between Friday, the day when Covey struck Douglass with the hickory board, and Monday, when Douglass fought Covey to a standstill? In the central episode, as I noted, we see the futility of trying to reason with the slaveholder. Despite the instructive and optimistic fiction in the Columbian orator, rational argument is not sufficient to establish freedom. Forceful struggle is needed. In his earliest childhood, it was suffering and anger that prompted Douglass to ask the hard questions about its status, about society, and about God. And later, it was his suspicion of the slaveholder and hatred of slavery that prompted him to learn to read when he found that the slaveholder prohibited it. His learning had often been stimulated by his angry rejection of his condition. What of the other two episodes? Douglass's theological reflections in the woods and his later encounter with Sandy's generous superstition. Despite the insufficiency of rational argument to obtain freedom, Douglass is still restlessly turning about the circle of belief and unbelief, between faith and atheism. He seeks to pray but cannot. His learning leads him to ridicule the magical route, but Sandy's generosity leads him to take it nonetheless. He disdains the superstition but yields a little too. He retains a pride in his education and reason, but tentatively trusts in the magical power, or he trusts in the providence that sent him his superstitious friend. Douglass says, one can only understand the effect of the combat if you've hazarded something in repelling injustice. You have to have had the experience of putting down a wager and risking a loss. To resist Covey was to make a wager, to put his life at risk in a moment of uncertainty. To succumb without taking that risk would have been to lose his future. He did not wish to die, to leave his bleeding body in the woods for scavengers, but he was not afraid to die if it meant living at the price of losing his humanity or his future. He risked his life to save his humanity, and he did so thoughtfully, rationally, resisting Covey, but not striking or offending him in any way that would certainly result in lethal retaliation. He faced uncertainty in body and soul, in the combat and in his theological reflections. At the moment he resolved to resist Covey, perhaps he hazarded an answer, took a wager on the theological questions. At the critical moment, I surmise, he again believed that the Lord had a great work for him to do. Or, magical root in hand, he trusted in his own nature and in nature's God. Probably it was the former, but in either case, the courage that welled up at the critical moment was not the irrational fighting madness of an animal. After all, it was his brutification that he was resisting, but the daring spirit of a persistently thinking being, one suspended in the balance and choosing. It's worth noting, as a denouement to the Covey episode, quote, the freedom from bodily torture and unceasing labor had given my mind an increased sensibility and imparted to it greater activity. Douglass quotes 1 Corinthians. Howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterward that which is spiritual. The subject for Paul is resurrection through Christ. For Douglass, it's the rebirth from brutification under Covey. At the moment that his humanity is nearly extinguished, his physical and intellectual struggle effected a resurrection. When the temporal needs are met, the dreams of freedom return. Recalling his teacher, Uncle Lawson, he begins to teach others. He establishes a Sabbath school so that his friends, fellow slaves, may read the Bible and understand the advantages of intelligence over ignorance. In the fullness of spirit, Douglass shares with others his learning and his dreams, setting them on a parallel course. They devote their precious little leisure to learning rather than to wrestling, dancing, or drinking, the diversions granted to them to distract them from freedom. And they risk their flesh to do so. As the local slaveholders come to see, Douglass was too dangerous to keep around. Let me endeavor to give some distillation of Douglass's education and freedom, though I fear I will not do justice to the facts. In his earliest childhood, he experiences a kind of freedom. His meager needs are easily met. His freedom of motion continuously exercised. Cared for by family and cut off from society, the freedom seems natural, although it is not the freedom of an adult anywhere. This earliest freedom is gently marred by the shadow of his future as a slave. When the reality of injustice is made fully vivid by witnessing absolute horror, his mind is set afire, asking questions about nature, history, God, prophecy, and justice, even if only in childish ways. As I said at the beginning of tonight's lecture, Douglass was told, give us the facts, we'll take care of the philosophy. But it had never been an instruction he could follow. for he was asking these questions from the beginning. The experience of freedom in his irretrievably lost childhood is transformed into a dream. Learning to read gives Douglass the wider knowledge and conceptual vocabulary to understand clearly why the arguments used to justify his enslaved status are false. Quote, this is to repeat, "The reading of those speeches added much to my limited stock of language and enabled me to give tongue to many interesting thoughts that had flashed through my soul and died away for want of utterance." He comes to learn that the slaveholder's religion is a sham, that there's no higher justification for slavery. He carefully reasons through the correctness of his own furtive resistance and rebellion. Yet this expansion of his understanding does not illuminate how he can change his state. Moreover, although his learning broadens his world and puts him in communication with far-off like-minded persons, it isolates him, cuts him off from the sympathetic care of neighbors. In spite of the sham religion of the plantation, through prayer and faith, he assumes a stance of patient expectation of an unknown future worldly work, trusting in a higher wisdom. When Douglass attains a partial freedom, freedom from corporeal punishment, and a tacit recognition of natural parity from his legal overseer, it comes not through rational argument, but spirited physical resistance. Yet it's not a self-forgetting ferocity. At the same moment that he's contemplating whether to forsake his life, to live, or to risk his life, he's also contemplating belief and unbelief, providence and atheism, superstition and true religion, so that the persistent openness of his thinking, that these are questions for him to decide, seems inextricably tied to his decision to put a wager down and to own his future. In the end, there's a consonance between his intellectual striving and his indomitable spirit of rebellion. This is as far as I will follow Douglass's education and freedom, although his freedom is not yet attained. In the story where I've left off, he is still a slave, still contriving an escape from Maryland. Even in the North, his freedom is incomplete. Still legally a slave, he's subject to capture and repatriation. And even in the North, he's subject to numerous forms of prejudice and injustice, which he describes, including the well-meaning condescension of his good friends with which I began. And even when he's legally freed, he labors under the burden of the continued servitude of millions of his brethren. I have, as far as possible, framed my reading of Douglass's life around the mysteries he identified, on the thought that his engagement with mysteries reveals somehow the kernel of his freedom. He could never have given us the facts without philosophizing, for one of the facts of his life was his intermittent, if nascent, philosophizing. Yet I feel obligated to note, as a caution to this interpretation, that the narrative often shows Douglass very eager, too eager maybe, to resolve the mysteries. When he asks, why are some people slaves and others masters? And this leads to questions about God and prophecy, he soon adds, quote, I was not very long in finding out the true solution to the matter. It was not color, but crime, not God, but man. I was master of the subject. The surrounding theological questions are waved off to return another day. And as the mature author of My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass is often ready to give precise, penetrating, if brief, philosophical analyses. Yet more than once, after digressing into such an analysis, he pulls back to say, but let others philosophize. It's my province here to relate and describe. Mysteries animate Douglass. They're woven into the facts of his life. They animate and inform his struggle for freedom. But pondering them is not his primary work. His liberating education always occurs in the shadow of an injustice to be opposed. In this, it is different from our education, which is happily more disinterested. Or, if there are deeper, stronger motives, they belong to each of us individually. Douglass describes, as beautifully as one could wish, the effects of shining light in the darkness, of the liberation of soul that light brings. Yet his revelations are often prompted by indignation at a seemingly intractable evil. And, as he said in the passage I quoted at the beginning tonight, sometimes he's moved less to philosophize than to denounce that evil with a view to uprooting it. I wanted to share several remarkable sentences from his speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. It's written around the same time, even if the tone of that work is not the same as the tone of my bondage and my freedom. On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? No one doubts it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? No, I will not. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. For it is not light that is needed, but fire. It's not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. Its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. At the height of his powers as a rhetorician and political activist, Douglass passes beyond the scope of liberal education. For, as Uncle Lawson had long since foresaw, the Lord gave him a great work to do. Thank you.